It's wonderful to be with you all. I believe this is our fifth webinar in our series of eight. And what I think is really interesting is how much has changed in the world since we started this series. I want to say back when we rolled out Landslide, looking at demonstration grounds in 2024, that Alcatraz and Independence Hall in Philadelphia were both included in that collection because of the innovation and creativity on the part of the Park Service to broaden their mission and vision when it came to these sites to tell a more holistic story. As we all know, at Independence Mall, the LGBTQ issue has become something that has been a challenge in terms of erasing information on the Park Service websites. And since that rollout, of course, there's been talk about returning Alcatraz to being a federal penitentiary. If anyone would have told me a year ago that this was the conversation we would be having, I would say, surely you jest. But we don't. And so to unpack where we are and maybe to provide inspiration of where we might be going, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our group today. We're going to have some opening remarks by Chris Longoria, and then Michael Boland will take it from there. Chris is an enrolled citizen of the Caddo Nation. She lived on Alcatraz during the occupation as a child and has worked closely with other veterans to keep the history of the occupation of Alcatraz alive on the island for the last 20 plus years. Thank you, Chris, for joining us. Michael Boland, is known to many here, the former chief park officer at the Presidio Trust from 2018 to 2024. And it is a distinct pleasure to have Michael here, who's been a constant source of inspiration and creativity for me in the work that we do at the foundation. Matthew Connolly will then follow as the lead park ranger with the National Park Service, specifically on Alcatraz Island. Tina Bishop, a founding partner of Mundus Bishop, an award-winning Denver landscape architect, a member of the board of the Cultural Landscape Foundation, and someone who's worked on a great number of cultural landscape reports on the West Coast. Cheryl Haynes, welcome, principal at Haynes Gallery in San Francisco, founding executive director and chief curator of Foresight. And for those of you that had the good fortune of seeing the Ai Weiwei show, you can connect those dots with her Zoom screen. And then finally, John Jarvis, executive director of UC Berkeley's Institute for People and Diversity. John served as the 18th director of the U.S. National Park Service from 2009 to 2017. And if you don't follow him on LinkedIn, please do, because his posts are really revved up and inspiring. And so thank you, John, for your leadership. With that, I would like to turn it over to Chris. Thank you.
Good day, relatives. I just like to offer some good day, relatives. I would just like to offer some tobacco and say a few words. I would like to acknowledge the 574 nations that originally occupied the territories we all occupy. I offer this tobacco to keep us grounded as we have this crucial conversations. May we all walk in a good way on this journey. Aho. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Great to see some of my National Park Service colleagues and also some of our community partners. I just wanted to kick us off in this really important discussion this morning by sharing a few thoughts about another piece of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, which is the Presidio of San Francisco. The Alcatraz Island and the Presidio are really similar places in a couple of ways. Firstly, they're part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, which, although I'm biased, John, I think is one of the greatest national park sites in the United States. And part of what I think is so important about it is that it was created to bring national park experiences to urban communities that have traditionally been underrepresented in national park visitation and have been underserved by national park experiences. So in 1972, the park was created, and it included an array of incredibly interesting sites, many of whom had very deep histories, sites that had been inhabited by indigenous communities for tens of thousands of years. The Presidio, for example, the traditional homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, and sites that really represent the complexity of the history of the American West. But in the early days of the GGNRA and of the Presidio, the story that was told was only a partial story of the history of the place. In fact, when the first National Historic Landmark District nomination was done for the Presidio, its period of significance started in 1776, for example, erasing tens of thousands of years of human history of the site. It ended at the Second World War, though many of the very important actions that happened in the Presidio occurred after the Second World War. So the question of how we preserve these sites in a way that builds relevance for everyone in America, that makes everyone in our communities feel welcome, that really reflects the diversity, the growing diversity of America, and how we can make these sites flexible, how we can keep them open, how we can empower the community to play an increasingly large role, both in the decision-making about the management of sites, but also in the storytelling of the sites, shifting from a kind of expert model to a community co-creation model. To me, these are really, really important and increasingly relevant questions that I'm hoping my colleagues on this panel today will wrestle with me in the course of our discussion. So I'm going to keep my comments very short. I'd like to pass the mic over to one of my fellow GOGA colleagues, Matthew Connolly. Good morning, Matt.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Connolly. I'm one of the lead park rangers out on Alcatraz Island. And I've been out here for about 5 years, having the opportunity to kind of tell some of these stories and really dive deep into the history of the occupation. There we are. So it's really interesting kind of thinking about this event, thinking about this history. You know, had you arrived to Alcatraz Island in the months, or the years, I should say, of 1969 up until 1971, as you come out here during the occupation, this is what you could have been greeted by at the dock. Young Native Americans playing sports, throwing footballs, playing basketball, and right above their heads, a bold sign that said, "Indians welcome, United Indian Property, Indian Land." This is how folks were greeted when they came to the island during those 19 months that they had taken over this site. And it's interesting kind of thinking about this history, thinking about the built environment. If we can slide forward one slide. You know, this is how you're greeted today. The same bold paint, full color. You can see there, Indians welcome, United Indian Property, Indian Land. You know, this is how thousands of visitors, 1.4 million visitors just last year, were greeted when they arrived to Alcatraz. This is right above the ranger's head as they present the dock announcements. Pretty much every single boat comes off and is greeted by a ranger standing directly beneath the sign. But if we slide forward one more slide, for many years that message was less apparent. It's so interesting kind of thinking about the built environment and thinking about the stories that are told, you know, if walls could speak. And if walls could speak, this one is not telling necessarily the same message. You know, the paint has faded. You can't quite see exactly what it says. The Indian Land at the bottom is all but lost. And particularly where it says United Indian Property, the sign had been replaced essentially several times, removing the Indian, or INDI, which laid over the states, even changing it to the, you know, penitentiary signage at various points because of various movies and things of that nature. So with this, you know, history being lost, the Park Service undertook an effort to restore this signage to make sure that that message and that history was captured and visible to all the visitors to the island in the years leading up to 2019. 2019 is the 50th anniversary of the 19-month occupation of Alcatraz by the Indians of all tribes. So we slide forward one more. So this is an original photo of, courtesy of Mary Turner, of Dennis Turner and Jonathan Lucero alongside Richard Oakes, shortly after they finished painting this political message on the dock sign in 1969. They painted it, they posed for this. You can see the proudness and the pride on their faces as they stand there before that photo. And based on historic photos like this one, based on other documentation that we have, we undertook a project to actually restore this. Now, so much of historical preservation in a national park context, in a public land context, really, you know, often involves preservationists, park employees, folks in a similar uniform to myself, doing a lot of this work. But this history is relatively recent on the timeline. You know, 1969, at the time of 2019, was only 50 years earlier. And there were many individuals still alive. In fact, this is Mary Turner, showing this photograph literally during that 2019 celebration of that commemoration of the anniversary. So effectively, we were able to work with our partners, work with former occupiers and their descendants to repaint this slide. I'm going to slide forward one more slide. We invited everyone back, put up scaffolding, and actually invited many former occupiers, many of the descendants, to actually repaint this sign and to restore it to its former status, so that folks could all, see Alcatraz as Indian land, just as they did during those 19 months, to basically have that political message be as bold and as visible as the day that it was first painted. So going back to that original photograph, just one more slide forward, please. It's so interesting. Nope. Forward, not backwards. There we go. It's so interesting to me thinking really about Alcatraz as Indian land. So many visitors today, we talk about this when they get off the boat, we greet them, we explain this history, but they still come up to me and they're like, why does it say Indians welcome? Why does it say Indian land? Were Indians here? And it's like, Indians were everywhere. Every single inch of this continent was once Indian land, including Alcatraz Island. As Michael mentioned, 10,000, 20,000 years of habitation prior to us showing up on the scene, prior to 1775, 1776, first European arrival to California, foundation of the United States. It was all once Indian land. And that long history of indigenous habitation, the original relationships that the United States and the government had with a lot of these tribes, that basically expanded from the East Coast to the West, taking over land, dispossessing all these tribes, basically moving them onto reservations, is all the events that lead up to this occupation. The prison itself, which many folks come to Alcatraz to see, operates until 1963, pretty much from 1850s, when the United States, California became a state when they first started building the first buildings on Alcatraz. For the next 100 years, they knew exactly what to do with Alcatraz. But come 1963, there was a large question mark in the timeline. What should come next for Alcatraz? They turned to the public at large, asked them what they should do. Ideas flooded in. And Native Americans, of course, amidst this large debate, had their own thoughts. In 1964, amidst various folks submitting ideas, Belva Cotier, a member of the Sioux Indian Nation, her husband, Alan, her cousin, Richard Mackenzie, came out to Alcatraz with their lawyer. They hammered down claim stakes, and they claimed Alcatraz under the then Treaty of Fort Laramie as Indian land. They only stayed for a matter of hours. The GSA caretaker who was here at the time, responsible for the shutdown prison, threatened to call the police, and they left. And they filed that paperwork under the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which enabled Sioux male Indians to claim their 40 acres of surplus government land. Alcatraz was surplus land, and it was under that 40-acre total. Like so many treaties that Indian nations had made with the United States government, it was not honored. 5 years passed, and amidst all of this, Native Americans, many living on reservations, are undergoing a lot of things in U.S. history at that time. There's a program and a process called relocation, which has basically allowed young Native Americans to move off the reservation, transfer them to big cities, help them find economic opportunities, because so much of the reservation land they had been set aside for them did not have, mining materials, did not have lumber, did not have game to fish, did not have water to drink. It was the, land that no one else in the government wanted. So as they come to these big cities, hunting the American dream, looking for those opportunities, many of them arrive to this place with promises of housing and a good job. And they find that that housing is in a really rough neighborhood, is in terrible condition, and that job they were promised is only for a matter of weeks. So these young Native Americans began gathering, forming groups, the Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland and the American Indian Center in San Francisco. And, they began talking about what to do about this, what to do about all the broken promises, about the broken treaties, about their history, their relationships with the government. And they began learning about their own history in a lot of ways. Many of the Indigenous studies programs that got started, these young folks went to college and they wanted to study history. They wanted to study their history. And history at that time was largely the history of white America. So they literally started their own curriculums, Indigenous studies, that allowed them to study their own history. They studied their treaties. And a lot of this education informs things like the original occupation. As more and more of these college students are learning this stuff, coming up with these ideas, being inspired by everything else that's going on, they decide to come back to Alcatraz in 1969, particularly as this kind of debate of what happens to the island is coming to a head. They wanted to turn into a university, or they wanted to turn the island into a casino and a resort and a Victorian museum. The hunt plan for it was kind of being heavily sought after by the city of San Francisco. So these young occupiers hatched a plan to go back to Alcatraz and to stay longer this time. They headed back to the island in 1969. They initially stayed for just 24 hours, basically played hide and seek with law enforcement overnight. They dived off the prow of a boat, swam out there, and they were removed. But with this removal, the group that had basically hatched this plan was even more inspired to go back. And just a few short weeks later, they headed back to the island and settled in for what ended up being a 19-month occupation, the longest occupation of federal land to this day. They stayed during that time. They put up political messages. They, made statements that could be seen from boats that came through the harbor, boats from all around the world, claiming Alcatraz as Indian land, talking about as land of the free and the brave, Indians welcome. These bold political statements that could be seen from all sides of the island. And it's so interesting to me, they were here for 19 months. The government ultimately removed them by force. Coast Guard and other law enforcement came and removed the final occupiers on June 11th of 1971. And so many folks ask, was the occupation successful? Did it achieve the goals, which was to get the land, to make it an Indian university, a cultural center, an American Indian museum, all of these things. And ultimately they were removed. It's a National Park Service site today. The negotiations, the various demands of the Indians of all tribes were never met by the US government. But what it did more than anything was it inspired a movement. It inspired so many folks, who started there as young college students, who went on to change so many things. By the end of the 1970s, almost 20 pieces of legislation had passed through the halls of Congress for their cementing and securing Native American civil rights and sovereignty and self-determination. It had ended the relocation program. It had ended the more insidious termination program, which was looking to remove tribal rights altogether, remove reservations altogether. And it kicked off the larger Red Power movement in a lot of ways. As one of the occupiers once said, I always knew I was Indian, but I did not know what that meant until Alcatraz. So it's so interesting to me kind of thinking about this event, not just in of itself, but in the larger context of everything that inspired to this day. One of those former occupiers who was out there as a young child who grew up a bit on the island was Benjamin Bratt. And he says, it's easy to pass off the Alcatraz event as largely symbolic, but the truth is the spirit and dream of Alcatraz never died. It simply found its way to other fights: native sovereignty, repatriation, environmental justice, the struggle for basic human rights. These are the issues Native people were fighting for then, and they are the same things we are fighting for today. So that struggle that began before Alcatraz continued through every one of those three occupations, continues to this very day. And folks are still in the fight, still in the struggle, and still consider this island such an important part of that history, and come out both for celebrations and commemorations of the occupation and also for sunrise gatherings twice a year. And I think thinking about all that context, thinking about that ongoing struggle, thinking about where it leads to today is really so much a part of the story of Alcatraz that we really want to tell on the island and that we are currently telling. And so much of this work is possible through how recent this history is, through the fact that there are so many occupiers and descendants who are still around to tell their stories, who are still around to partner with the Park Service to repaint these messages and to help us do the great work of making sure this history is preserved. So with that, I want to turn things over to my friend, former occupier Chris Longoria, and such a great collaborator who's helped us do so much of this work when I've been on the island and in the years even preceding my arrival.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, dear relatives. I'm sorry you guys couldn't hear me earlier. I don't know what happened. I'm usually pretty loud. I'm just going to say a few quick words of the prayer that I said. I said, good day, relatives. I would like to acknowledge the 574 nations that originally occupied the territories that we currently all occupy. I offer my tobacco to keep us grounded as we have this conversation. May we walk in a good way on this journey. Aho. Alcatraz. Thank you, Matt, for giving the history. I was a child on Alcatraz. I was 6.5 years old when I arrived on Alcatraz. I was the person that Matt quoted said that I didn't find out I knew that I was Indian, but I didn't know I was Indian until I arrived on Alcatraz when I was 6.5 years old. I was on and off the island for 19 months, for the 19-month duration, anyway, staying from 2 weeks to 3 weeks to 1 day to 2 days. So we were constantly on the island um, during the occupation. My family were really big were activists. They weren't leaders. My mom wasn't a leader on Alcatraz. We were supporters. But prior to Alcatraz, we were already in activist movement. My mom was and my tia were um, red hippies. They started out with the Cesar Chavez movement, and then when Alcatraz happened, we moved on to Alcatraz, and that's where I found my redness. Prior to that, we had been involved with Cesar Chavez, the Black Panthers. So my childhood was very different than most people's childhood, as we were always around some time of movement and some kind of protest. So upon arriving to Alcatraz, um, I was just surprised to see so many Indians at one place, and especially since during that time we weren't it was illegal for us to practice our prayers, our culture, have our ceremonies. So one of the big impacts on my life of being on Alcatraz was seeing the teepee, because in 1969 it was illegal for religious ceremonies. And I was very fortunate because my grandmother, um, I was raised by my grandmother. My grandmother was relocated to San Francisco during the relocation, her and her brothers. And so they were some of the first Native Americans that come into San Francisco. So I was able to see her and all the new um, Native Americans that from relocation come into San Francisco. And I was able to hear my grandmother's stories from the original relocation people. And then as my mom got involved, I was able to see the activist side. So I feel now in my life that I'm able to carry the stories of the old San Francisco, of how the American Indian Center started, how Intertribal Friendship House became a big part of the community, and then eventually our family heading out to Alcatraz. Like I said, I was on and off for the 19 months with my family as a child. But it's crazy because I had my daughter when I was 22, and when she was 5, I started taking her to Alcatraz for sunrise ceremonies. That's all that was going on. And at that time, there was only one sunrise ceremonies, and that was on Thanksgiving Day. And that was started by Bill Wapapa and the International Indian Treaty Council. So they had started that, and that is completely different from the occupation of Alcatraz. It's two different organizations. So they started that, and I started going to that, and then every year I would take my daughter. Eventually, Indigenous Peoples Day came around, but um, I think what we are with Alcatraz all has to do with Uncle Eloy Martinez. And he is the one that worked with the Park Service for over 30 plus years now to make sure that the story of the occupation of Alcatraz stayed on the island. So everything that we are doing now on the island, because we are doing a lot on the island now, is all because of Uncle Eloy. So he kind of brought me into the circle with Fawn Oaks, and during these last 20 plus years that I've been involved, we've seen many changes to the island. Everything at first was a struggle. I'll be honest, it was a struggle with the Park Service, and Uncle Eloy had many difficulties. But it's full circle to see how beautiful our relationship has grown now, to where it is. And now we've continued this work to where now we have a yearly commemoration on November 20th. That is the day that Alcatraz was occupied by our dear relatives. And so we're able to come back to the island now and on November 20th and celebrate that day and, give education to the community. And through that growth, we've been able to now work on getting a new exhibit up on Alcatraz that I'm very, very proud of the veterans that have worked on this to get the story out from the original occupiers. And it's a living story because we could not capture everybody's story at once. But we're hoping that as the exhibit is up, that we'll capture more stories and get more information about the occupation and all the hundreds of people that came together for that movement, because that's where the Red Power started. That changed. Alcatraz changed everything for our people. And I'm really grateful that as a child that I was a part of it, but it's kind of stunning that I came back as an adult and here I am 25 years later, and I'm still involved and I'm heavily involved, and I love that place, and that's my urban res. I never knew my homelands because I was born and raised in San Francisco due to relocation. So I call that my urban res, and that's my sacred spot, and it's our sacred spot for all of our 574 nations throughout the United States because it holds a lot of history, but that's where we found our power. Thank you guys so much for listening to my story. I could go on forever and ever. I have so many great stories and so many great people that I've met. And yeah, I don't want to take too much of your time. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tina Bishop, and thanks, Chris, for that wonderful story. That really resonates with kind of my understanding and connection to Alcatraz Island. My connection to the island is as author of the 2010 Cultural Landscape Report, and also further documentation of Cell Block A, rooms within the hospital wing, and the new industries building that supported the Ai Weiwei exhibit in areas on the island that had not been open to the public before. My work is in documenting many of the stories and vestiges that Chris and Matt have been talking about, including many of the stories and messages that you see from 1969 to 1971, and also in finding actions to preserve and manage those for the long term. Matt talked a little bit about what the island would have looked like when the occupiers first came on board. The image on the screen is from the Bureau of Prisons time at the end of their use, and you can see it's pretty substantial in buildings and other components. Next. Historic images of the island and some of the buildings pre-occupation really show that huge extent of buildings and facilities that the Bureau of Prisons had put together, and what you would have seen as an occupier gives you a good idea of what folks would have seen as they were initially experiencing the island. I think it's important to note too, the island was pretty functioning in 1969 with water and electricity. Next. Research and investigations and documentation from the work that we were lucky to do reveal the stories of the land and place and voices. In this case, particularly the voices of those who occupied the island from 1969 to 71. This period is really significant. It's one of 8 periods that comprise Alcatraz Island's period of significance of 1847 to 1973. And I was really inspired, Michael, when you were talking a bit early on about the fact that that period of significance really misses the mark in addressing earlier periods. And that's something hopefully this panel can talk about too. The most obvious vestiges, of course, on the island from the 69 to 71 period are the markings and things I'll show you in a minute. Etched markings are probably the most well-known. And of course, Matt talked a lot about the sign that you would have seen when you arrived. Equally compelling are remnants of many of the buildings. The image on the right is the warden's house. Right after several of the buildings had burnt during an unfortunate and devastating fire during that time. Next. I think Matt said it well, and I agree. Walls can speak. During the time when the occupiers lived and championed to claim Alcatraz Island is really a key important period when we talk about it from a social and political history that goes well beyond the physical changes that occurred. It's also important to point out that during this time, looking at this period in particular through the lens of the political history is really key. Many of the other periods of change on Alcatraz Island really just related to governmental changes and modifications that would have happened at that time. Next. Ceiling spaces and places also speak. The soot in cell block A on the left, that's a ceiling. Political messaging in cell 3 and cell block 3 in the center, and then the cells themselves speak as well. These markings really tell the story and reveal how much of the island had been occupied during this period of 69 to 71. And I think it's really important to note the extent of the use was across the island, likely into every building and space during that time. These messages were first categorized and identified in 1977, and they're really important components to tell the story. Hopefully Chris agrees that the preservation of these are key within the essential messaging of Alcatraz Island, especially for future interpreters and visitors. Next. And lastly, I did want to point out too that the land speaks as well. Many of us that come to Alcatraz Island now experience more in this state than what you would have seen in the Bureau of Prisons period. The immediate response after 71, when the occupiers were removed, was GSA's demolition of many of the buildings. They also put up a barbed wire fence, installed keep out signs, and included demolition of the garden and playground on the parade grounds. These images are of the demoed apartment buildings on the parade ground. And as many of you all know, demolition stalled as the site was moved to the Department of Interior and the NPS in 1973. Next. In reiterating the importance of research, investigations, documentation, and in setting actions for future presentation, it is essential to acknowledge that we are comprehensive in all of this. And Chris, as you were talking about Alcatraz being a living story, it's important to include those stories, as Matt mentioned, with the people that are actually connected to that time. It also includes protecting and preserving and interpreting those vestiges that may not always be seen as the traditional preservation features. All of these are essential in revealing the history and significance of this time and preserving those voices and places, especially as that living history, as Chris mentioned. And I will pass it off to Cheryl. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. What a great conversation, and I'm honored to be part of this panel. So yes, I'm picking up on the fact that spaces have voices, and I guess I would take that one step further and say, and the artists help us listen. So I've stepped outside the box a little bit here on my presentation next, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the other projects we've done before I get to At Large, Iowa Way, and Alcatraz. So we've been working in the Presidio and the GGNPC for GGNRA, sorry, for over 20 years, and each space has its own personality. Next. And one of the things that I find so rewarding about it is that by Art About Place, is it illuminates ideas not only about the cultural and natural history of a place, but also makes the relevance to this conversation, to this moment in time, apparent. This is just a sample of the projects that we've done in the park thus far. Next. And there's always a position to be taken. This was the first time we activated the only extant Civil War fort on the West Coast, Fort Point, during the 75th anniversary of the building of the Golden Gate Bridge. Next. Some of the more impactful projects, in my opinion, however, are really talking more about the cultural history of places that are hidden and have not been released. This was in a World War II bunker and related buildings, and it was talking during a period when we were all concerned about building barriers and borders, and this is when the conversation just started about fear of other and immigration. Next. Of course, that hasn't gone away. As a matter of fact, it's probably been amplified in recent years and months. At this time in 2008, we know who the administration was, and it was very important that we find places of sanctuary. So we commissioned artists from around the world to design rugs, prayer rugs, if you will, to reflect their notion of sanctuary. I'm threatening to bring this project back. Next, please. Currently, we have a show once again in Fort Point, and it's called Black Gold Stories Untold, and it's about the early Black citizenry during the gold rush and the Civil War period here in San Francisco. Next. But we're really here to talk about Ai Weiwei on Alcatraz and the Indigenous history. And this project, though a contemporary project, I think does speak to the early history in a way that is very eloquent. And I learned so much by doing this project. Next. So Ai Weiwei, for those of you who don't know, is a Chinese dissident artist, and he was detained by the Chinese government for speaking out for his beliefs. He was a prisoner of conscience. Next. So when we decided to do a project on Alcatraz, it was important that we kind of marry his personal history with the history on island and somehow bring it into a contemporary dialogue. So we focused in many ways on the prisoners of conscience and worked with Amnesty International to bring a sense of truth and justice to this project. So we included people that were truly not people who were perpetrators of violent crimes, but true prisoners of conscience, people who have spoken up for their beliefs. Next. Next. Okay, we could go back one. Now, though Ai Weiwei is a Chinese artist, so he really needed an entry point to this location. He couldn't come to the island. He'd never been there. He still has never been. So we had to work remotely to make this massive project happen. So his entry point was talking about the relationship between China and Tibet and likening it to the relationship between the US government and indigenous peoples. And I think that that was an effective way to talk about what happened here on the island early on, many years before the occupation. Next. So one of the things that was so fascinating, we learned when we were working on this project, is the very first prisoners of conscience on the island of Alcatraz were Hopi individuals. They were sent there by the US government because they refused to educate their children in Western ways. And they were incarcerated there, I believe, for about 18 months. Next. So while we were working on this project, we thought, it's really important that we engage some of the people that we're depicting, or at least addressing. Next. And we came up with a notion that we wanted to activate one of the psychological cells, detention cells, with a sound piece. Next, called illumination. And it was basically, let's listen to it. I think I can talk over it, but it is the Hopi Eagle Dance. And it is very important work, apparently. And can you hit the sound button here? It's right here. Can you see it? Okay, I don't think it's working. But we thought before we presented this piece that we should speak with them. And unexpectedly, there was a group of Hopi elders that were visiting the island for other purposes. And while they were there, we interviewed them and spoke to them. And they said, oh, yes, we're honored that you would do this. And in one of the cells, we did the Hopi Eagle Dance. And in another cell, we did Tibetan chanting to make that relationship more apparent. And they told me this story that was so hair-raising that basically when the Hopi elders returned to their communities, they carried back with them the thought that it was over for them as a people. That the Westerners, in their words, paraphrasing, had weapons, had such shows of strength, were just impossible force to be reckoned with. And it was at that moment that they realized that they were about to lose their place and their lands. Thank you.
I guess I'm up next. Thanks everybody for all those fantastic presentations and incredible background, and Chris, particularly your personal experience as well. So I'm John Jarvis. I served as the director of the National Park Service under President Obama. I was also the regional director here in California over Golden Gate National Recreation Area. So I have a bit of knowledge about its history, the Presidio, and Golden Gate. And hi, Michael. It's great to see you again. A little bit of history about the Park Service. It started out as big natural areas in the West, established on indigenous territories, often with forcible removal of Native people. And then in 1933, in a legendary story, FDR was coming back, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was coming back from a bit of R&R in Shenandoah National Park. And Horace Albright, then director of the National Park Service, convinced him to transfer all of the Civil War and Revolutionary War battlefields and monuments to the National Park Service. In a stroke of the pen, an executive order, essentially, the Park Service was transformed from basically a nature-based organization to one that was the keeper of the American story. And you look at the Smithsonian, which does a fantastic job of telling the American story through its collection. The Park Service's role is to tell that story and its multiple layers through place, through the individual sites where, in many ways, the fires of our democracy have burned and sometimes have failed. In recent years, particularly during the last 20 or 30 years, the Park Service has been reaching out to try to suss out the untold stories of America, particularly the contributions of women and people of color, and have looked to existing sites like Golden Gate, Alcatraz, and others to bring out the stories that have been either suppressed or not told at all. And then adding new sites to the portfolio of the National Park System, such as recent additions like Harriet Tubman, Colonel Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers, or Cesar Chavez, all new monuments established by President Obama. They also to look to stories that I would suggest demonstrate when we failed to live up to the ideals stated in our Constitution. Things like Manzanar, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, or the racism suffered by Black workers at Rosie the Riveter, World War II, or the Black sailors that were imprisoned after the explosion at Port Chicago. And then using our venues, using our places to bring out even deeper stories, such as the Ai Weiwei exhibits at Alcatraz that sort of carry much, much deeper messages, not only about ourselves, but about the world. I think that also in the same period, a much deeper understanding of the impact to Indigenous people in America by the establishment and the continued occupation of their territorial lands within the National Park Service. In many ways, it has caused some self-reflection by the Park Service to rethink our current management and to seek out and develop co-stewardship relationships. A lot of that was highly moved forward by the just past director Chuck Sams and Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland, who really put emphasis on a deeper relationship there as well. Also, the interpretation of sites. While we have extraordinary professionals like Matt at Alcatraz, we have been working to create the opportunity for those who were involved, those can tell their personal stories, as Chris has done, to come and speak from a personal experience. And that's a little bit different than the traditional park ranger in the uniform standing up on the stage and telling these stories. When you put all of this together, Alcatraz is kind of a great microcosm of all these changes, everything from how what was considered the period of significance and how that has expanded to include the occupation, all of the stories and the layers of stories and how those stories are to be told is really fantastic and has been, frankly, only been able to be done because we've had partners with those that were occupiers at the time, along with the Golden Gate Conservancy, having a nonprofit that can sort of get away with things that perhaps the Park Service can't over the times. I mentioned the self-reflection. It's even caused the Park Service to go back and look at lands that should be returned, like at Death Valley, where almost 8,000 acres were returned to the Timbisha Shoshone people. All of that in the context, and I can get away with saying this, that we are in a very strange era right now. Under the Trump administration, there's an effort to revise history, to take away the negative stories, to tell the story only from the sort of male white perspective. And the Secretary of Interior has directed parks to identify negative stories, has asked the public to identify negative stories. And I must say I have a very hard time putting a happy face on the history of slavery or the forced removal of indigenous people, the incarceration of Native people at Alcatraz for nothing more than trying to protect their own history and their own culture and their own children. So our ability, in my view, to tell these stories authentically and with scholarship is really helps our people live up to the ideals that were stated in our Constitution. And it is embedded in the mission of the National Park Service. Stop there. Thanks.
Wow. I'm just going to start with a wow. I'm so inspired by everything that we've heard this morning. And I want to first start by thanking all of our panelists for everything that you've shared. It's truly incredible. And also want to encourage anyone in the audience, if you have questions, please do share them in the Q&A. But I just wanted to start by just reflecting on some of the things that we heard. First, Chris, I want to thank you for kicking us off so beautifully. And I was really, really inspired to think about how powerfully important Alcatraz has been in your life, but also in the history and in the contemporary circumstances of Native people all across America. The power of place is something that continues to marvel me as a landscape architect, and I think marvels all of us that work in a national park context. Matt, your notion of walls speaking is such an important one, builds on that idea. I think what's also interesting is you talked a little bit about how organizations like the Park Service create space for groups of people, many people in the community, and John, you talked about this as well, to translate those stories and to make them available, make them visible to the public. Then Tina, you also came back to this notion of walls speaking, but I think the important thing I took away from your comment is that it's important to approach the translation of those stories with humility, with what I would call a beginner's mind, and with a broad-ranging effort to interact with people that actually were present for the important events that occurred in these places that we're trying to talk about. Then Cheryl, my co-conspirator in so many great things in the GGNRA. Your work just continues to inspire me. And I think particularly in historic places like the Presidio, like Alcatraz, that are highly significant, that have a great deal of integrity, the use of temporary artist interventions that are co-created with community is such an important way, such an easy way, and such an exciting way to keep places relevant, to make them relevant, to elevate hidden stories, but also help us do it in a way that maintains the essential essence of the place. So from a preservation standpoint, allows us to remain true to and maintain the integrity of the place. And I can tell you that these artist interventions have a very long lifespan, way beyond the actual exhibition themselves. And then John, you have inspired me for many, many years. And I think it's safe to say that you single-handedly push the Park Service forward in such a profound way in terms of ensuring that national parks really welcome everyone, taking these sites that historically have really served the few and frankly, originally were designed to serve the few, and truly achieving their, what I think of true purpose, which is making them parks for all. And during your tenure at the leadership of the Park Service, you really pushed that work forward. So again, I'm really humbled to be here on this panel with all of you. So in terms of what to talk about, wow, so much. So there's so much to dig into. I'm very interested in one question that we haven't really talked much about, which is how we, as land managers and stewards, how we can create space for multiple perspectives, multiple stories to be told at one time. I just had the good fortune to be in South Africa and visited the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, spent some time in Cape Town and went to the District 6 Museum. And what really struck me is the way that the South Africa, which has such a difficult and complicated history, has made a real effort to allow for multiple perspectives to exist simultaneously in their interpretation. So I wonder if we could talk for a moment about how we can do that, how we can create space for multiple stories, multiple conflicting stories, multiple perspectives in the same site, and if anyone has examples of places where you think this has been done really well. So, anyone thoughts about that?
I'll try a little bit.
Yo, Tina, thank you.
It's a big question, Michael. You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, Alcatraz is actually one of those places with those multiple histories, right? And what better opportunity than to make it the example? It's really a palimpsest of stories. You know, Cheryl harkened back to the, you know, the stories of incarceration of Indigenous people at Alcatraz. And that's kind of a missing story in what we talk about these days. You know, looking at it through the lens of a researcher and documenter, you know, it shows up as this blip in the 1870s to 1890s. But, you know, it was a result of what, you know, at the time were called the Indian Wars. So that is definitely kind of a missing story. I feel like I do think Alcatraz has become a better example of that since the 2019 exhibit, and then the refresh of that as well. And of course, I had kind of a front row seat at the Ai Weiwei exhibit. And what Cheryl's showing you in those images is that's the new industries building that, of course, had been rarely opened up to anyone. And so you get that layering of those multiple stories. It was, you know, the workspace. That's where the inmates went to work every day. And then you saw a couple of the other images in her presentation of the hospital wing, and, you know, the heart-wrenching, you know, idea of incarceration can also be told in those places. So I do feel like many of those stories could happen in that place. I don't, off the top of my head, have a good example of where it's happening elsewhere. but it's also a very interesting, intriguing question. Thank you. John probably does.
John does.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say one set of parks that I would include would be the Civil War parks. So during my time in Washington, we had the commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and we went about it intentionally to shift the storylines from what had been traditionally, you know, battlefield stories and the size of the cannonballs and how many people died, and you know, where Pickett was and Little Round Top and all that stuff, without ever talking about slavery, the cause of the war, the politics behind it, the service of Black troops, the impact across communities, the role of Indigenous people, all of those. We really wanted to retrain and frankly reframe history. You know, as they often say, the North won the war, but the South won the history. And there was a shift at the time, of course, then with Reconstruction, and that story really didn't get told. And so many of our battlefield interpreters shifted that interpretation, sometimes with a bit of pushback from some of the visitors, but also an opportunity to express that. I think one of the other ones, and more recently and certainly contemporary, is Rosie the Riveter, World War II home front, with you know, Betty Reed Soskin and her ability to tell a personal story of her service, the racism, the segregation, her role in the unions, the impact to the Richmond community, the Black community, all of that, beyond the home front story, which is really what the park was established for. But there is a much more layered set of stories there. And again, like bringing Chris and having her be involved in the story of Alcatraz and the occupation, bringing the community elders of Richmond there to tell those stories as well has been incredibly transformative to everybody that's been involved.
I would just like to say one thing before we end. Alcatraz is full of so many stories, especially um, indigenous stories, and I'm hoping with the way that we collaborate with the National Park Service and the Conservancy, that we will not only be able to bring the story of Alcatraz, which we are bringing it to life, but the other stories, the Hopi stories, bringing that to life. The Choctaw Kid who was who was in prison there, and his family is still here in the Bay Area. So there's so many stories, and like I said, Alcatraz is a living story, is because we are still doing stuff on Alcatraz. We're still making history on Alcatraz. We had Deb Halen out there. That was the first time anybody from the Department of Interior, I think, since I've been involved with the island, has been out there. But we've also had other ceremonies out there that people don't know about. Leonard Peltier is now out of prison, but we had a ceremony for him on there, and people don't realize that connection to the island and our ceremonies from all the Bay Area urban Indians, especially us that were here uh, due to relocation. So, like I said, I could go on forever, but I just want to share that Alcatraz is such a beautiful space, and I will continue to share my stories and capture other stories of my relatives that have kept space there on the island. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Chris. We have a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A I wanted to put out for the group. The second one's a little bit long, so we'll start with that one, I think. National Register nominations often define periods of significance through architectural or written documentation, but this approach can exclude Indigenous histories, which may be carried through oral traditions that communities do not necessarily wish to have formally documented. Since this framework reflects a Western standard that may not be shared by Indigenous peoples, how can we bridge that divide and create space for Indigenous voices and narratives to be meaningfully included in the nomination process? So, and before we maybe give the panelists a couple of seconds to think about that, Cheryl, I think you had a comment you wanted to add about the last question.
I'm so sorry I wasn't being forward enough. Two things. One of them is not to be so self-referential, but the Project Black Gold Stories Untold at Fort Point, the Civil War period fort, I think is a very good example of telling multiple stories, because the National Park Service just did a brand new interpretive exhibition there that is of the highest quality possible, talking about the Buffalo Soldiers, talking about the history of military history in the park, but to be able to overlay the stories of Black citizens from the Civil War, the Gold Rush, and the Reconstruction on top of that, and telling the stories of incredible achievements of Black community members, yet still respecting the history is there, including Charles Young and the Buffalo Soldier. You know, that's a very complicated story, and we've only heard one side of it for the most part. So I think for my experience, it's been really successful. People have commented on it many times. We've had almost 70,000 visitors. And I would love to go back to Alcatraz and do a Ai Weiwei style scale exhibition around the indigenous history, and actually was working on a proposal when the latest news surfaced about the possible repurposing. So I have put a hold on that for the time being, but I would love to go back and do something large scale and hopefully impactful there.
Thank you, Cheryl. I hope you do. So back to the question about National Register nominations. It's actually something that's really come up for me in this conversation is both the specific question that was asked, but more generally, is the idea of period of significance dead? So,
Right, Michael, I'll jump in initially,
Yeah.
since the Park Service is the keeper of the National Register. I was very involved as director in, let's say, redirecting the the staff in seeking out and adding National Register sites that weren't sort of in the traditional sense of, you know, outstanding architecture. I probably shouldn't do this, but I'll tell you a quick story. So when I became director, I met with the National Register staff and I said, what's your next area of emphasis that you're going to focus on for nominations? And they said second homes. And I said, well, after a bit of a shock pause, I said, well, you're not going to do that because that just perpetuates the focus on the wealthy and the white. And we're going to seek out, because clearly less than 10% of the register reflect the contributions of women and people of color, indigenous people. So I think to me, the way to change that is to seek out independent and academic historians, students in particular, and commission them to write the nominations. And particularly students that are interested in their own history and their own culture, their own experiences, to help us find those places. The theme study is one of those approaches that the Park Service took. We did the LGBTQ plus theme study, the Asian American Pacific Islanders, the Latino Hispanic theme studies. These are to give us the broad historical themes, and from that we can pull up potential nominations for the register, for the national landmarks, and then potentially even units in the system. But I think internally, the Park Service is probably too inherently conservative to do that. It really is going to require us to reach out to organizations outside of the NPS to really help us generate those kinds of nominations.
Hey, Michael, I just as a former NPSer of 15 years, I want to sort of jump in on this one as well, because I do think that this question also echoes the whole cultural landscape movement. And, you know, when I was at the Park Service in '92, the program I managed, which started in 1990, was called the Historic Landscape Initiative. It wasn't called the Cultural Landscape Initiative, and its responsibility was any resource outside of the Park Service system, but it was defining it as a historic landscape, thus not ethnographic properties. And I think one of the parallels here, and we see this play out all the time, is that many of the most iconic places in America were very early designations of the Historic Preservation Act. Many of the first NHLs, they were often one-page nominations. I mean, one of my favorites is Biltmore, which is on a piece of typewriter paper, on a loose leaf paper on one page, with the forestry plan. And I think the challenge we have is also having the space to revisit those designations. It's not something that I think is a priority for most administrations. And what happens as an education and advocacy organization is we find ourselves in Section 106 situations. I mean, perfect example right now in San Francisco is the Embarcadero, where the period of significance ends in 1949 because has a very building-centric focus. And no one has sort of said, well, Halprin, Armand Valancourt, the rebirth of the city, etc. So I think part of the challenge here is creating an opportunity to revisit place. And I just want to say in closing that our webinar just last week, we were talking about Central Park, which is, now revisiting its NHL to great extent in a pursuit for World Heritage designation. And it is about the cultural stories and the lifeways, not only pre-contact, but everything that's played out in its 150 plus year continuum. And so I do think this question really does echo the cultural landscape movement. And in broadening our net for Indigenous people and cultural lifeways, I think we can learn a lot by sharing some of the similar challenges that we've gone through.
Thanks, Charles. Tina.
Thanks, Charles. That was great. I did think of a couple of examples, so thank you for the extra time. I'll put a plug in here for History Colorado. I work on their state and national register review board, and they are probably a good example. They've made a concerted effort to bring on fellows. And as Charles mentioned, they are younger and they are from all diverse backgrounds. And the nominations we are looking at these days are most about social and different types of histories and less about, the architectural value. So there's a big plug there. Another piece too, thinking positively about the National Park Service, because I do think we are the keepers of the most wonderful places. Some of the work being done in Alaska is really looking at less about a defined period of significance and more about even geological timelines. Lake Clark Preserve at Twin Lakes, for example, looking at the Dina Ina people and how that the lifeway doesn't end at this period of significance, that it carries on, and similar work being done at Sitka National Historic Park. So I think there are some good examples in there. I just wanted to give a plug to those guys.
Awesome. Thank you. We have another question in the chat, and I'm not sure who to direct this to. John, you might be best positioned to speak to it. How is Alcatraz fighting back against Trump's directives?
Well, Matt could probably answer it, but he shouldn't. I think throughout the national park system, I can't speak specifically to Alcatraz, but interpretive teams are attempting to comply as best as possible with the Trump orders about negative history. There are independent efforts out there, the Save Our Signs effort to capture interpretive materials, interpretive signs, to preserve them so they can be restored after this administration is done and gone. Because we can put signs back up, we can revise them, restore them. I think right now the fear of retribution and is real within the service, that if they attempt to openly defy the orders, they will probably be fired. And I think they've proven that does happen, regardless of the positions. And there's a lot of control attempting out of Washington directly to the parks about what they do, what they say. The whole public affairs side of the Park Service has been removed and now works directly for the Department of the Interior. So they can't even talk about it. to the press as well. But Park Service is tough. Let me just say, they've been through some tough times in the past. They are resilient. There's a lot of really, really amazing people still working hard to deliver on the stewardship and the protection as well as the interpretation of these parks. And I think they will survive this. It's probably one of the toughest periods in the Park Service's history, but I have a deep and abiding faith in the agency and its employees that they'll make it through this.
All right, thank you, John. So I have I think we got time for one last question. I'm going to direct it to Matt. And I'll read it, share it with everyone. Chris, thank you so much for your comments and thoughts. I'd be interested to learn more about what happened to the Native Americans who were forced off Alcatraz. What were the next steps? Did Uncle Eloy jump in as a leader to pick up fairly soon? I remember those days as I was an employee outdoor recreation planner with the Bureau of Outdoor Recreation, which was later merged with DOI NPS. So maybe Matt and Chris, if you'd speak to that. Thanks.
I'll take a first stab and kick it over to Chris. In the immediate hours after the removal, I believe they gave a press presentation. I want to say it was at Center Hotel right there on the waterfront. There's some really iconic photos taken of that. And, you can see both them making these really bold statements still, but also incredibly sad that this had come to an end. But they immediately went on and kind of took the inspiration of Alcatraz to other occupations. Both during Alcatraz's occupation and following it, numerous other occupations were inspired. Here locally in the Bay Area, they occupied an old Nike missile site in the East Bay Hills. There was an occupation up in Davis of an old Air Force base that became Denali Quetzal University, DQ University, for many years. And some of the occupations were more successful, particularly the one in Davis and the one up in Fort Lawton Park, old military lands in Seattle, which still is on a 100-year lease for an Indian cultural center up there. So these folks basically took this playbook and continued to occupy, continue to agitate. As I said, many of these folks got involved even more so in politics and activism. We see a lot of things being passed through the halls of Congress, folks going congressional testimonies, rising quite high in the ranks of their respective tribes. Wilma Mankiller, for example, who was out here as a young occupier, goes on to become the first female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And I think just a couple of years ago, she's now on the Women's History Quarter series. And it's so wild to me thinking about these young college students, basically just, first cutting their teeth. And if you were to go to them and be like, hey, Wilma, in 50 years from now, you're going to be the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation on the back of a quarter, at a time when Indian head pennies were still in wide circulation, she would have laughed in your face. So these folks basically started off a larger movement that still goes on to this day. And they are passing the torch for those who are finally, Eloy, who Chris mentioned, and so many others are still in it, but they're really passing the torch to the next generation as well to continue this larger struggle for sovereignty and self-determination.
Thank you. Yes, Uncle Eloy, he did not jump in after. He just started building his relationship with the Park Service to bring us where we are now. I consider him a leader. He does not think that he's a leader. But afterwards, I can talk about my family. My mother, my grandmother came and picked me up 5 days before the ending of the occupation. And my mother, when the occupation was over, ended up going out to Pitt River. There was a bunch of occupiers that had left Alcatraz and went out to Pitt River, and they were fighting PG&E at the time. So my mom was out there for a while, and when she did come back, she was arrested and she was in jail. And but a lot of them had went on, and they still continue to work. And it's like what Matt said just about Wilma Mankiller. It's me. I was 6.5, 7, almost 9 years old. Here I am, 63. Last year at 62, I was scared of the teepee. I thought I was going to get arrested, and I couldn't run anywhere because I was surrounded by water. And now I am one of the keepers of the teepee lodge. We installed that teepee last year. Never in my mind did I imagine being there as a child, the responsibilities and the love that I have for the island now. Never in my wildest dreams. And now this weekend, 56 years later, we are opening up a permanent exhibit on Alcatraz. And that's something that these relatives fought for. They wanted an education center. This is a museum, education center, everything all in one. And I am so grateful that at 63 years old, I am able to see what my mother, my aunt, Richard Oakes, Dr. Lenita Warjack, what everybody wanted to see, that it's coming to life, and that we are still on Alcatraz, and we are still doing things on Alcatraz, and we are still making things happen. And I love Alcatraz with all my heart. Aho, Red Power.
Chris, I can think of no better way to close up this fascinating morning than your remarks. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the panelists for being part of this really, really interesting conversation and for doing the work you do. It's so important that we continue to ensure that public places tell their stories and tell the stories that really reflect the breadth and depth of American history in a way that's really welcome and accessible to all. So I think Charles is going to close this up. Thanks.
Super. Michael, Chris, John, Cheryl, Tina, Matthew, thank you. What a great and provocative session. Thank you for your candor and your generosity. Just as a reminder for those that are here for the CEUs as well, Sarah has reposted again the quiz in the comments section. I want to thank Victor Stanley, and I want to just sort of note that if you've enjoyed the series, our last two are coming up on October 29th and November 18th. On the 29th, Maura Rockcastle from 10 times 10 will be hosting a conversation about a pair of campus protests at Fisk and Gallaudet. And then for our final one, we'll go back to California for Chicano history at Salazar. Chicano history looking at Salazar Park, excuse me. Adrian Scott Fine, the director of the Los Angeles Conservancy, will be moderating. And for us, it's a perfect capstone in the series because it shows how historians, landscape architects, and interpreters are working together to push history forward through design and stewardship. Thank you all, and happy fall. Cheers.